Can you hear us okay? Yes, okay, well, thank you very much, all three of you, for a really interesting morning. And I think Tanya kind of opened up the themes of the conference really well by giving an overview of her ideas concerning the work of Mira and how she's beginning to think of, she's been thinking about the exhibition for a long time, but beginning to form together a kind of what I guess is a kind of a spatial representation of the body of work. In the context of the whole trajectory of Mira Schendel's life and work, I'd like to start by referring to something that's popped up in all three presentations, which is a kind of a questioning of conventions, particularly historical conventions and conventions in relation to forms of representation. Briony mentioned conventions of documentation through photography, for example, and ways of thinking in terms of display. I would like to kind of bring that back to how we think outside of Brazil of the history of Brazilian art during the 20th century as kind of forming a convention. We now, with Brazilian art becoming so kind of discussed about, I mean, the way it has become kind of mainstream over the last 10 years, has also brought particular conventions in the way it is understood and the way the history of modernism and abstraction in particular in Brazil has come to kind of inform contemporary art production. So I'd like to start by trying to break down some of those conventions, and perhaps we can kind of discuss those a bit further and then open up. I quite like the fact that Tanya began speaking of kind of the 1950s and really the beginning of Mira Schendel's career as an artist. I mean, it's quite incredible that she starts making art in 1949. And by 1951, at the time of the first edition of the São Paulo Biennial, her work is accepted within the kind of open submission. At that time, it was an open submission exhibition. And I was particularly glad that you mentioned Volpi, because I think Mira Schendel and Volpi share this peculiar position within the history of Brazilian art, in which they kind of break down these kind of easy conventions that have been established within the canon of let's say of Brazilian art. They don't fit very well.
They don't fit neatly at all.
No, I mean, if before I kind of pass it on to you, there is an interesting anecdote about Volpi and in relation to those controversies at the first biennial, where I mentioned in the introduction, where the traditional modernists, Brazilian modernists that dated from the 20s, that were very informed about the idea of the need of modern art to represent the true people, the workers, and it's very kind of leaning towards Soviet socialist realism against the kind of incoming abstract, and particularly geometric abstract tendencies, and some of the most outspoken critics of abstraction during that opening São Paulo Biennial was the figure of G. Cavalcanti. And by the time the second biennial happens, as a kind of compensation, the kind of jury for the second biennial prize the Brazilians were almost. It was almost a given that G. Cavalcanti would win the painting prize as a kind of compensation for the fact that he had kind of had been so mistreated during the first edition, and much to his dismay, to Di Cavalcanti's dismay, Herbert Reed comes along and mentions how interesting this kind of artist is, Volpi, which kind of draws on the kind of popular traditions, but also on abstraction, and didn't quite fit in either. So this comment leads to Volpi sharing the prize for national painting with Di Cavalcanti. So anyway, I think Mira kind of has this kind of a similar position in which she disrupts our assumptions of what Brazilian art during the 20th century is, and disrupts it in a very positive way, in a very interesting way. So perhaps I think my first question, after commenting on Tanya, my first question would go to Isobel and Briony, where there's a kind of crossover within both presentations in terms of Mira's use of letters within her compositions, and I was particularly interested in Isobel's discussion on Schoenberg's kind of interpretation of the letter A, as a kind of a sign of a deep. I think you mentioned the depersonalization of modern man.
Interpreting some of them in that way, if they're on their own, it's pretty kind of.
And as a kind of a questioning of this kind of conventions of formal progressions within art history, for which Briony was referring to through this kind of conjunction of abstraction and text. So I think you mentioned duration as well, which was something that in the 1960s was something that Elio Oiticica was drawing on through his investigations on colour. So I'm quite curious to see how ideas on duration between abstraction and text and kind of formal progressions can relate between artists so diverse as Elio Oiticica and Mira Schendel. If you see any kind of coherence, particularly in terms of Bergson's notion of duration, I can't quite understand how.
I think that, it was something that perhaps we all mentioned in different ways, because Tanya showed that image called Zeit, time, where the T is kind of extended. Schoenberg mentioned Bergson explicitly. I don't know if Schendel read Bergson.
I think she did. I think she'd read. Well, Bergson's more in the background, but she, I think the connections between Schendel and Oiticica come through their philosophical reading, and because Oiticica is reading phenomenology, and time is an integral part of the theoretics of.
I was wondering if there was a connection through Schendel, because Oiticica admired Mario Schendel, Mario Schoenberg very much too.
I don't know. I think Schoenberg was important to a certain universe of artists he collected. I think that it can be dangerous to go back to relating Schendel to Oiticica. I think that it's better to kind of come back to that after going more densely into her work.
I think this is why I was thinking that to highlight the notion of being is really important, because whilst Oiticica and Clarke maybe are thinking around corporeal perception in that sense. I think that Schendel is thinking around being in a much more expansive way, and therefore the responses she comes up with in her work are much more idiosyncratic to her and her kind of European engagement with a kind of much broader section of continental philosophy and responses to continental philosophy than maybe Oiticica is, who has this kind of very clear kind of take on.
I think what I was trying to very inarticulately to get at was how phenomenology is referred to in very different way between kind of people like Oiticica and other kind of like Ferreira Goulart, how the kind of neo-concretes understood and related to phenomenology. It's very different from how Mira Schendel approached it, so kind of approximations are often quite dangerous in this sense.
Can I just come back on what you said at the beginning, Michael, about the different takes on, the letter? Because I think there was a kind of, for me, really interesting collision, of different readings, which in some ways, what's interesting is they're kind of incompatible, or are they? That's the question. And in a way, it's the question of, legibility versus illegibility, which I think is a really interesting area. And, for me, in a way, I was really thinking of this as you were talking, because it raised so many interesting questions about what we do with the work. Because on the one hand, it's about bringing the density of this work into the world at that moment, and what could be its field of reference. But, arguably, you could imagine that Schendberg, giving a kind of symbolic reading of the letter, is not reading it wrong, but reading it in a way that the work maybe exceeded then, but maybe has subsequently come to exceed. That is to say, what's really kind of core problem for what we do is, when is the meaning of the work made? And obviously art history privileges the moment of its production. But I guess to me what's interesting is its afterlives, or that sense of how that slips and shifts. And I thought you opened up this amazing terrain of slippage where, in this dialogue between these two figures. But that for me, to its illegibility seems important to kind of hold on to, because I think in a way the work is more interesting than arguably Schendberg's interpretation, although, I'm coming at it from, a point of ignorance there. So for me, I thought what was really interesting was this way in which perhaps the work itself dramatizes this space between legibility, letters, a kind of archaeology of letters. And I know I didn't really attend to that enough, the archaicism of those marks that she makes. But also this kind of dynamic between origins and leftovers, because she seems to, and that's in a way because it becomes something that, we're not so much imposing on the work, but the work seems to do in some, do that work in some way.
I think it was probably a quite deliberate strategy in some ways, because I always liked and admired the fact that she kind of refused to explain the work, didn't like speaking for it, would sort of explicitly say, you tell me what it's about. And so I think that there is a kind of provocation, and in some ways I was quite drawn to trying to figure out what those letter A's were, because I could never really explain it to myself, how they were a bit like human figures, and why an A. I didn't have the answers, but there's a sort of provocation in the work that's a lot like provocations from other areas, from philosophy, say.
On the one hand, they do look incredibly anthropomorphized. I mean, how else are you meant to read these kind of congregations and individuals within a landscape other than to anthropomorphize them? So in a way, I completely understand where Schendel is coming from, and the temptation. And I was talking about some of the very literal examples of how you can read terms and concepts that give you a way into the work. But I think that you're absolutely right, because she did deliberately refuse to explain what the work was all about. And this is why I think that particularly Iko's text on the open work is really important, because it stakes a claim for leaving meaning to be completed by the viewer, and therefore this being a very conscious strategy that she is developing in respect of her work. And she goes to visit Iko in 67 or 68, which is exactly at the moment that she's making the graphic objects, and this kind of deliberate openness to interpretation is part of their structure, I think, absolutely.
And again, I think as Briony was saying, it's always tempting to kind of try and understand how those dialogues took place, but it'll be interesting to see what kind of effect that type of work has on new viewers, because I think they exert a certain kind of fascination that's to do with them refusing meaning in a way. So I think that's one of the important things about actually having the work physically present, which is something I was sort of more or less trying to say, is that it's very difficult work to talk about from a reproduction or from a sort of universe of temporary exhibitions even. I think it does actually have this effect on you when it's confusing you into trying to put into words what on earth it is trying to do. And I always thought that as a very distinct aspect of why it works as a work, if you like.
I'm aware of the time, and I think we should open up for comments and questions for the next 15 minutes or so. But could I ask if anyone wants to comment or ask a question to wait for the microphone, please? We have over here, Guy Brett.
Actually, this is really a request for information. How much do we know about Mira's relationship with Zen, for example? And did that extend to having some kind of, was she supposed some kind of teaching, given the huge Japanese minority in São Paulo? And because I just asked that because an interest in Zen would be quite a revealing way of linking a whole lot of artists in different parts of the world, and with no particular bias towards the United States or Europe. So it seems a very and you feel you just feel intuitive that there's a lot of Zen in Mira's work. But I was just wondering about her actual biography on that point.
It's mentioned in one of the biographies, the one from the Sonia Salzstein exhibition, that she practiced Zen meditation. No?
I think she did have a kind of interest, and I think that it is very interesting to think how we could link different artists with Mira that shared that interest, like Mark Toby or someone like this, because the work shares certain characteristics as well. It's not something I've looked into specifically, but I think maybe it's there's a sense in which Tomio Otaki is also coming at issues that are derived from a kind of background in an Eastern set of philosophies, rather than but it's mediated also by the Brazilian context as well.
You asked the question, but you yourself have written about Mira's work relating the notion of the active void. Is that
That actually came from that's her phrase, not my phrase. That actually,
but relating that to Zen.
Yeah, and also because that phrase comes from a letter that she wrote to me, in which she also talked about Zen. Mm-hmm. It's just that I've read somewhere that she actually attended a group of people interested in Zen, and I just wondered if that, I read it somewhere, maybe in the chronology that's published in the book. The only before the recent catalogues, the book that Sonia Salstein edited.
If I just make a short comment about it, I think in my book I mentioned also that she, at the time that the mother died, she did she frequented a group of meditation, Zen meditation in São Paulo. I don't have much further information about it, but I spoke at that time with one of her students that she had a short group of students that frequented her studio. And at that time she went to a practice on meditation, maybe lasted about 2 years or so. Okay.
There's a question over there.
Yes, this is a rather fundamental material kind of question, but considering that she had exposure to topography and probably also worked in offices and provided that kind of work, as you mentioned that I believe the letraset was introduced in the early 60s, so it was a very new, modern, and rather expensive material. I couldn't help but notice that in some of these, not particularly this one, but in some of the letraset works, they were composed of all the letters that are left over. I don't think there are too many people here who actually remember what a sheet of well-used letraset looks like, but it's fundamentally composed of P's and B's and D's. And in looking at these, I cannot see a single E, which was one of the most used letters. So I'm just wondering if the origin and it was a very simple thing of this is available, it's being thrown out, I can use this somehow, and it carried over into kind of the works that she was doing.
I think that's possibly a very interesting point, because there are references to particularly the early part of her career where she is buying in Porto Alegre, she's buying quite cheap materials and economies, which is what I also said, her working as a typographer, the economies of and also the production of cards as part of her, what do I do with this urge to create art, and yet I have a family to support. So these are considerations, and she's always very careful with materials. Even the later works with the use of gold leaf, it's all incredibly beautifully sort of.
I mean, you mentioned that she worked producing book covers, and that is a kind of graphic design type work, which is where you would have letraset. I mean, I'm old enough to have worked with letraset in the 1980s. So I think there could be a relation there. It's a kind of interesting.
I mean, letraset's introduced in 1961. The company set up in 1959, but letraset becomes obviously unbelievably successful quickly as a design tool, the kind of professional designer's tool. So that's a very interesting observation.
One more quick question about something, Tanya, you could probably answer this. Everyone has said she was born in Switzerland, but not exactly where. Now, Switzerland is sort of German, French, and Italian canton, so maybe obviously she was from a German canton because of the Heidegger, etc. But presumably she was possibly close to the Italians, which made it so natural for them to consider going to Italy?
Well, her family had. I mean, actually, Geraldo's done all the research on this, but her family came from Italy and went to Zurich was where her parents met, but her father had to leave because of naturalization laws around Jewish identity. And so he goes to Berlin when she's very young, and her mother to's and fro's between Berlin and Zurich because of that, and then they split and her mother returns to Italy. So it's Zurich where she's born, but she spends time with her maternal grandparents there because her mother is with her father in Germany, in Berlin. So there is an immediate impact to do with the kind of family situations and also anti-Semitic laws and conditions in Europe that impact on her experience of family life, and also, you know, the early displacements and the kind of linguistic and cultural heritage that she has. But then they do move to Italy, her and her mother, and she acquires a stepfather, as I said, who's director of the Bibliothèque Nationale, and that's more or less stable, but she is then brought up as a Catholic.
Leftover language, leftover letters.
Exactly. And that phrase that Ada always repeats, like she spoke many languages and none of them fluently, which I think is an exaggeration, of course, but describes the constant use of different language in her life.
I just wanted to say something in relationship to the leftover thing. I've heard that with the monotypias, occasionally she didn't have money and would use them almost like a currency, so to pay her doctor. So her doctor or her therapist would have them in the collection because she used them as currency. I don't know whether this is true or not. It's sort of one of these things you hear. Have you heard this? No.
I know that they're sort of given and they drift, and the process of researching works for this show has been very much of tracking down where they are, and there are monotypes and other works in different places in Europe as well, where you can almost trace the route of her travels by the distribution of monotypes in Europe. It's literally, they're everywhere that she went.
The other question at the back.
I also was going to remark on the absence of vowels in these discs. I don't know whether that's true for all the works in this particular series on acrylic. But I wondered, I mean, it's really interesting to think about the leftovers, but also to think about the questions of opacity and transparency in these works. And then you think about how that maps over into sounds. So vowels would be, you think of in relation to something that's more open, but these Ds, Ps and so on are more closed, or I don't know if they're plosives, but you know, you think of in terms of blocking sound or very immediate sounds rather than open ones, and whether she's playing with that across this body of work, or is just in the two instances that we've seen, both of which were just all the letters but the vowels.
It's interesting. I mean, I think there are some vowels, aren't there? I mean, it's not consistent, but I think obviously the existence of vowels tend to make short syllabic sounds, don't they? Whereas the clustering of consonants refuse meaning. So, you know, this is part of the opacity of these letters that are absolutely not congealing into words, but into these other sorts of substance that seem quite immaterial because of the transparency and the translucency, but have their own sort of substance, quality of a substance that is, I feel, kind of typographic and not symbolic, but obviously it's bordering there in terms of her possible intentions. But it seemed to me very interesting in terms of commerce and design and the interface with this work with that, in a way, a kind of currency, the look of the world, you know, the look of typography in the world. And as a typographer, that kind of huge sensibility that she would have had to that. But, you know, I think that is very much an effect of the work.
There is a relationship with sound as well in some of the works of the 70s, though, when the sort of speech bubbles, it's like she's trying to get the works to speak.
There are also some notebooks which play with an ambiguity of whether they are describing words or not. There's a number of books which are N-O or O-N, and then there are other books which are which start with E and go into C and then to O, and you can see that maybe it's echo, and maybe it's an extended echo, or maybe it's echo as in Italian of there it is. So there's an ambiguity of meaning as well, which is shifting, or it could just be E's and C's and O's and nothing, and no meaning. But
I might be mistaken, but I have the impression I read somewhere that Mira Schendel talks about Mira's work in terms of the relationship between sound and image, doesn't he? Music and image. Yeah. So what exactly did he mean about that? Could you expand?
Not today, no. I don't have a reference with me. Sorry.
Maybe tomorrow. We'll talk about it. There was another question over here.
Just in the spirit of, when is meaning made in relation to her work, because I don't know her work at all, and I don't know the genealogies that she comes out of, but in that spirit of when is meaning made, and from the perspective of a kind of deferred action, and what might someone encountering the work or her story today unleash through a process of deferred action, I was just struck, listening to all the presentations, of the kind of coordinates of a topology that seemed to perform or dramatize perhaps an anxiety that took in kind of cosmological anxieties or questions, as well as, at the level of a kind of microspace of post-Newtonian topologies, as well as questions of the subject in relation to language. And I'm thinking of, because, the Heideggerian, just hearing her story that she had so many mother tongues, she was cut by so many paternal structures of different kinds of language, there were so many epistemological breaks, it seems, in her formation, that I'm not in the least bit surprised that language and just the kind of thoughts, even though she doesn't seem, has a Jungian sort of take from what I've heard today, or even an Eastern take. But at the same time that she was working, there was extraordinary work going on in relation to subjectivity and the agency of the letter. I'm thinking of Lacan's text, The Agency of the Letter, and the idea that the letter traumatizes the body, divides the subject, produces a kind of panic-stricken register in the drive. And I just know this was going on in Latin America. There are artists who are thinking about that trajectory, and I just wondered whether you have any thoughts about that, because clearly what is being performed from a micro to a macro level is a kind of anxiety around subjectivity, placed in a cosmos, placed in a world with God and Father. At one point this comes up, is being thrown into question. There's no response from the place of the dead God, The paternal function, the Oedipus function, is being questioned at this moment. And I wondered how this had filtered through and to what extent she was picking up on this.
I say a couple of things in response to that, not on how she was responding to it, but just responding to you. Because I think that's a really interesting emphasis and an important one, that this could be thought of as a topology, because what it isn't is systemic. It's absolutely not like the system, to me anyway, the preoccupation with systems that you might imagine, through communications theory and so on, that's pervasive, and that her way of imagining this would be perhaps better thought of as topological, and there's a very different set of coordinates. I think the idea that it's a kind of micro space where things are almost, you could think of even the lettering as something kind of blown up, these tiny clusters, but also this, as you say, a kind of huge cosmological, or these kind of centrifugal forces that seem to be, taking you everywhere between the micro and the macro. That seems important. But how it would differ surely from the...
I just want to bring in the idea that it might also be a symptomology, linked with her own symptomology around some dimension of being cut or traumatized by language and epistemological breaks. And by the dictator, nobody mentioned the impact of the dictatorship when she gets to Latin America, if there was any impact. Sorry to cut across you. You've talked about what was happening in Europe, but not the dictatorship and whether that impacted.
This is something I've been more interested in recently, actually, is how people have positioned her work in relationship to the politics of Brazil, and usually interpret it in a very clumsy way in relationship to the politics of Brazil, and never really get to the core of what that experience would be for her as somebody who had already been through a kind of intense, multiple political moments in her life, and then to come to Brazil and sort of settle, and then for that to be disrupted. And I think it's a very careful and distinct relationship that has to be made, not by just saying, oh, this work was made in 68, this work was made in 69, therefore it's a reference to, which some people have done in a very heavy-handed way. But I think it's a very important question. I mean, how do you respond after being kind of pushed out of Europe and through Europe and into Brazil to another kind of huge disruption on the kind of political level? And maybe it's something that will come up in later conversations, but I think it's something to be handled quite carefully.
Yeah, I think that's a good point and a necessary point to break for lunch, as we would like to be back here on the dot at 2 o'clock, no? And continue the conversation and discussion after the following session, which will be chaired by Tanya, I believe. So thank you very much, and see you all back at 2.